In the early months of 1943, the Pacific Ocean was a graveyard of ambitions. For the Allied forces clawing their way across the scattered islands north of Australia, the war was not just a series of battles, it was a daily fight for survival in an unforgiving world of heat, disease, and relentless enemy pressure. The Japanese Empire, still vast and menacing, stretched across half the map. Its armies had conquered with lightning speed, its fleets moved like predators through the seas, and its soldiers fought with a fanaticism that defied reason. New Guinea had become one of the fiercest battlegrounds in this struggle, a land soaked with rain and blood, where men sank into mud as deep as their courage and every breath carried the stench of decay. The Allied High Command, battered by months of stalemate, was desperate to find a way to halt the Japanese advance and keep the enemy from reinforcing their garrisons. For the men on the front lines, every day without reinforcements felt like an eternity spent at the edge of defeat. It was against this desperate backdrop that a convoy of Japanese transport set sail from Rabaul, the Empire's most powerful stronghold in the South Pacific. The plan was simple and devastating. Over 7,000 seasoned troops, escorted by destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns, would steam across the Bismarck Sea to reinforce the struggling Japanese army in New Guinea. If they succeeded, the balance of power on the island would tilt decisively in Japan's favor. The Allies knew this, so did General George Kenney, the sharp-eyed, restless commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force. Kenney was no ordinary general, he was an innovator, a man who believed that wars were not won by obeying old rules but by breaking them. He looked at the grim reports from his bomber squadrons and saw a truth that few wanted to admit: high-altitude bombing, the tactic the Allies had relied on since the war began, simply didn't work against ships. The cold statistics were damning: 97% of bombs dropped from above missed their targets completely. Pilots risked their lives for little more than splashes in the sea. The Japanese convoys kept moving, undeterred, defiant, untouchable. Something had to change. Kenney's answer was audacious: some called it reckless, others suicidal. He wanted his men to fly lower. Much lower. Instead of dropping bombs from the safety of the sky, he wanted them to skim the waves, charging straight at their targets as if they were fighter pilots, not bomber crews. It was a technique few had dared to try before, a tactic once dismissed and even banned by the Allied High Command as too dangerous. But Kenney believed that in this theater of war, where the jungle swallowed armies and the sea swallowed ships, survival would belong only to those bold enough to defy convention. The technique was called skip bombing. Like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond, a bomb released at just the right height and speed could bounce across the waves and strike a ship's hull before exploding. It was a simple idea, but executing it required nerves of steel and precision flying of the highest order. There would be no second chances, no margin for error. One wrong move, and a plane could slam into the ocean or be shredded by the wall of gunfire that awaited them. To make the plan possible, Kenney turned to one of the most brilliant and unconventional minds in the Pacific, an engineer and former civilian pilot named Pappy Gunn. Gunn was a legend among the aircrews, known for his fearless flying and his genius for improvisation. When Kenney came to him with the idea, Gunn didn't hesitate. He began modifying the B-25 Mitchell bomber, a sturdy twin-engine aircraft that had already earned a solid reputation in the Pacific. Gunn's modifications transformed the B-25 into something entirely new, a flying gunship built for low-level attack. He stripped away unnecessary equipment, reinforced the nose, and packed it with .50 caliber machine guns, up to 8 firing forward. This gave the bomber an entirely new capability: it could now strafe its targets head-on, mowing down anti-aircraft crews and clearing a path for its deadly bomb run. With these Pappy Gunn specials, the B-25 became a weapon of vengeance, fast, aggressive, and brutally effective at point-blank range. Still, even with the modified aircraft ready, the tactic was forbidden. The official doctrine was clear: bombers were not to fly below 1,000 feet over the sea. The risk of being hit by enemy fire or crashing into the water was simply too high. But Major Ed Larner, one of Kenney's most trusted squadron leaders, understood what was at stake. If the Japanese convoy reached La, it could tip the entire campaign in New Guinea into catastrophe. Larner had seen too many missions fail using conventional methods. Now, with Kenney's blessing, and his promise of silence, Larner began training his men in secret. In hidden corners of the Australian outback, crews practiced flying at altitudes so low that their propellers churned up spray from the water. They rehearsed timing, release angles, and escape maneuvers until every move became instinct. The training was brutal and unforgiving. A single mistake could mean disaster. But the men of the 90th Bombardment Squadron were determined to master the impossible. They knew they were preparing for something extraordinary, something that could change the course of the Pacific War. When the orders finally came in March 1943, there was no time for hesitation. The Japanese convoy had been spotted, a long line of ships cutting through the Bismarck Sea, shielded by destroyers and the thick curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The weather was rough, visibility poor, but that mattered little. For the men who had trained in secrecy for this moment, it was now or never. Engines roared to life as dozens of bombers lifted off from their dusty airstrips. The pilots, grim-faced and focused, knew what awaited them: the wall of death, the roaring flak, the tracer rounds that would claw at their wings. But they also knew something else: the old ways had failed, and this was their chance to prove that a new kind of warfare was possible. The forbidden tactic was about to be tested not in theory, but in blood and fire. As the first waves of B-25s approached the Japanese convoy, the sea erupted in chaos. The bombers came in low, barely 50 feet above the water, their engines screaming as they raced toward their targets. Enemy gunners opened up with everything they had: machine guns, cannons, flak bursts that turned the air into a storm of lead. But the B-25s kept coming. Their forward guns spat fire, shredding the decks of the destroyers, cutting down gunners before they could react. Then, at the last possible moment, the pilots released their bombs. They skipped across the waves, 1, 2, 3 bounces, before slamming into the sides of the ships and detonating in massive columns of flame and steel. The effect was devastating. Japanese ships that moments before had seemed invincible were suddenly torn apart, engulfed in fire, or sinking beneath the waves. The forbidden tactic had worked. In just 11 minutes of hellish fury, the air crews of Major Larner's squadron rewrote the rules of air combat. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 Japanese transports and 4 destroyers had been destroyed. Thousands of enemy troops, trapped in burning ships or thrown into the sea, would never reach New Guinea. The 7,000-man reinforcement force had been annihilated before it even set foot on land. The cost to the Allies was minimal, only a handful of planes lost. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the entire Pacific campaign, achieved not by superior numbers or firepower, but by courage, innovation, and defiance. What had once been forbidden had become the key to victory. In the aftermath, General Kenney's gamble was vindicated. The success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed everything. The tactic that had been banned twice by cautious commanders was now hailed as revolutionary. Skip bombing became a cornerstone of Allied air strategy in the Pacific, giving American pilots the edge they desperately needed against the Japanese fleet. For the men who had risked everything, there was a deep sense of pride, but also sorrow. They had seen what courage could achieve, but they had also seen the human cost of defying the rules. The sea was still littered with wreckage, the air thick with smoke, and the memories of the fallen lingered long after the victory. Yet in that moment, amid the wreckage and ruin, one truth stood clear: the war in the Pacific would never be the same again. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just another military engagement, it was a turning point, a moment when innovation triumphed over tradition, and when the courage of a few men changed the fate of thousands. From that day forward, the pilots of the Pacific carried with them the legacy of Major Larner, General Kenney, and Pappy Gunn, the men who dared to disobey, and in doing so, found a new way to win. It was a forbidden tactic, born of desperation and brilliance, that shattered the enemy and shifted the tide of a global war. And though history would bury it beneath the larger battles and louder headlines, those who were there knew the truth. On that day, over the grey waters of the Bismarck Sea, the impossible became real.